Hey, guys, welcome. Generative Energy Podcast number 70. Ray Peat, Georgi Dinkov. Ray, I just interrupted you, but we were talking before about like what was your take on Australia? And I thought you had an interesting take that I really haven't heard before, so I thought everybody would enjoy that.
For several decades, it has seemed that they've been heavily manipulated by the CIA or whoever the world manipulators are. And so I see their extreme reactions as being a test case for how fast they can get away with imposing stuff on different parts of the world. But I think the reaction there is strong enough that maybe they're going to hold back and think of something a little less crude for the U.S. and Europe.
And then we also talked about, I told you I was a little confused on why, like, the power elites would want to turn the U.S. into a third world country. And we were talking about just the possibility that the citizenry of the U.S. are the last remaining threat to the power elite. And once they were subdued, they could do all their illicit, weird activities without any interruption.
Yeah, in one of her recent videos, Lee Merritt, an anti-vax physician. She said that in her state, the number of people who own guns would be the equivalent of, I forget what it was, the fifth largest army in the world.
What? Why do you think
they don't simply own guns? They also regularly shoot them. So they're well, maybe they're not on par with an active military, but they can put up probably a pretty decent resistance if things really start getting ugly.
Yeah, even though the firepower is like 1,000,000 to 1 in favor of the Pentagon, the actual ground level situation, if you have 1,000 people with little guns and 100 soldiers with bazookas and tanks, it becomes a better balance.
Do you think the Pentagon has managed to vet its what you call it, the most loyal soldiers it has to the point where they're completely confident that none of these people will turn on them if they're being ordered to attack their own families?
I think that's the purpose of Biden's talking about dishonorable discharge for people who don't get vaccinated. He doesn't want any ambiguous people ambivalent about following orders. Once he gets the vaccine resistors out, then he's got a nice robot army.
So we can expect something really bad when all those people are vaccinated, all the soldiers.
Yeah, if they're really giving them the same vaccine that is causing the CDC's death and disability numbers to rise astronomically, then it's going to weaken the army. But I would suppose that they know better than to give the regular vaccines to anyone they want to rely on.
Did you see that the CDC chief, Walensky, whatever her name is, she overruled her own advisory committee and basically went against the recommendations? The advisory committee said, no, most people don't need a booster. As corrupt as we are, that's too much even for us. And she said, nope, I'm going to overrule you. Is that legal under federal law? Does the agency have like supreme power over the agency?
The agencies can set their internal regulations, and I've interacted with some agencies that just really didn't take their own regulations seriously.
So what I'm hearing is that these advisory committees are largely ceremonial. Basically, they're just sitting there and making mood decisions, but ultimately it's the agency head.
Yeah, just for giving it a little prestige.
I'm scrolling through looking for an article, but it was talking about during H1N1, the government class was issued different vaccines than the population. And so what you're saying is like rooted in the mainstream article that I had come across at some point.
Yeah, several people have been talking about the evidence that several different vaccines or non-vaccines have been issued, and the elite get the non-vaccines.
Yeah, just a week after it emerged that German armed forces were getting a different kind of A/H1N1 vaccine to the general population, Der Spiegel magazine reports that the government will also get special treatment. What you sent me Dolores Cahill's video, and she was talking about an interesting way of kind of holding people accountable that were forcing vaccines on people. Is there can you talk a little bit more about that?
Just a personal liability lawsuit is one of them. You have injured me, and I'll take you to court and get redress. Another one was making them aware of the fact that they're committing a crime if they do anything to coerce someone in any way, but especially to take an experimental medical treatment. that is worse than simple undefined coercion. But coercion is a felony in some states and a serious misdemeanor in all the rest. Federal law allows up to 3 years in prison for coercion.
But these lawsuits, they would only apply to the actual doctors, the private industry doctors, because the government officials have qualified immunity, right? Just like the cops, they cannot be sued for doing bad things to us.
Yeah, but your employer, who is administering the illegal
I see.
regulation, they would undoubtedly say I was just following orders, but that has not been working very well.
So even though OSHA can mandate the employer and say, look, we're going to fine you if you don't vaccinate your employees, and the employer does, then the employer is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place because both places can attack, right?
Yeah, and if the employees make it expensive by suing their employers for damages, if they get fired, then the company has to start thinking which side they'll take.
Many of the small ones will probably just simply fold and close shop, which I'm starting to think that may be one of the desired side effects, even if it's not planned.
Well, the plan, as expressed by Eric Schmidt, more than 2 years ago, it was in line with the Rockefeller Foundation and other long-range plans, but the Pentagon committee that Eric Schmidt was the chairman of outlined the need to destroy the existing economy of the United States so that it could be quickly replaced by a digital artificial intelligence economy. That was expressed in 2019 before there was a pandemic.
Yeah, you can see this.
So we all shop from Amazon, we all get our IT from Google, and we all get our healthcare from a single mandatory provider that we don't even get our healthcare. We are administered healthcare against our wishes.
Yeah, and as the small businesses went broke, the Amazon and other giant corporations just about doubled their wealth.
Yeah, the office building where my office is, basically the company that was renting it out to small companies like me, they went bankrupt, and BlackRock, the massive financial company, moved in and bought all the real estate in DC.
Mm.
Yeah, Ray, do you have opinions on Vanguard and BlackRock and how they own a lot of the huge major corporations? Like, people think there can't be coordination between these huge, like so-called private corporations and stuff, but apparently they own like everything.
Yeah, I saw someone analyzing the tentacles of Vanguard. They're everywhere with 5 or 6% ownership, where they can have a strong influence.
You know who I think did? Go ahead.
They're just about identical with the World Economic Forum in their policies and reach.
And guess who owns the private funds behind Vanguard? It's basically a who's who of the neocons, the Bush family, the Rumsfeld family, the Clintons, like the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds.
Yeah. So no surprises here. Or I guess how this thing is unfolding. Is there anything you think is incredibly weak or a route to escape, or do you think they're more or less the plan is going according to how they planned it?
I think it's going according to plan.
You don't see any glitches in their push for the vaccine for everybody and for the lockdowns. I mean, I can tell you, as liberal and woke as DC is, if another lockdown is attempted here, even the liberals will revolt and probably hang the mayor if she tries something like that.
That would be good to see.
Right. I'm saying that even those people who were convinced initially that this is a good thing and they're trying to save the world and everybody should be vaccinated, they've had enough of basically being stuck at home with the screaming children and doing the work of both teachers and doctors and everything and doing their own work. So even the I don't know, the coastal cities, I think the population has had enough. So I just don't see another lockdown unless there's a false flag operation with another virus or something militarily happens domestically.
They keep talking about alternative panic producers, like a sudden breakdown of food supply or banking crashes, internet shutdowns, and so on. They've been talking about that for so long. I think it means they have something in mind, not necessarily those.
In one of the articles, you talked about how the Appalachian region has the lowest death rate from breast cancer, even though the rates of breast cancer are higher than the rest of the country. And you also mentioned how extremely rural areas and poor areas would probably not notice, whenever the collapse of the world economy arrives. So a question to me is is there any reason why you wouldn't consider going to the Appalachian region, or you don't think it's high enough altitude, or you think the culture there is not very, friendly? Just curious.
Yeah, there are pockets of culture that could be acceptable, but other places, the xenophobia, basically, not just according to skin color, but just having the wrong accent of an outsider can be difficult. I would choose a completely different country where they're used to tourists and Anglo people don't have such a xenophobia.
Ron Unz has an article on his website recently about a journalist who went to Welch. It's a town in southern West Virginia. It's the poorest town in the poorest county in the entire country. And he basically chronicled the decline of the area, which used to be booming in the 50s due to coal and kind of coincided with the peak of America, from what I'm understanding. You said that the 50s was really the time where people had everything they needed and nothing they didn't. And just the way he described the area is that because it's so poor, they've really opened up to tourists and they're really friendly. And there's basically very little internet and very little cell phone service, and everything is dirt cheap there. So I don't know. Sounds very attractive to me. If I have to make a move from out of DC, that will probably be the first place I would try.
I think poverty in terms of the internet culture is a very creative, highly progressive thing.
Well, it seems like people from Monterrey are very westernized, and that's something.
Monterrey, Mexico.
Yeah.
Buildings there. I've seen slogans. Hitler was right, and the cops there are the nastiest I've ever seen.
Oh, wow.
In Mexico. It's not just Americanized, but it's the worst industrialization can do to a government.
Good to know. One thing I was interested in getting your take on, I'm not sure if we've ever talked about it, but the incoherent narratives that conflict, just watching Fauci contradict himself 100 times. And I think a lot of people would tend to say, oh, that's because our leaders are so incompetent. But what do you think about that being a strategy of terror, of confusion, to make people so confused that it inactivates them because they don't know what to do because nothing makes sense?
I think it's natural for them to just talk through their hat, and it turns out that also is producing confusion and working in the direction they want people to go, panic and confusion.
I have a book. It's by a guy named Kurt Lewin. I think it's like 1942 or something. And he was some bigwig at the Tavistock Institute. And in his book, he says, if we just confuse people enough, they won't know what to do. And even if you're a renegade, you will be inactive because there'll be no like clear path forward of what to do because everything is so, I mean, that's basically what they do in the U.S. Like the people that consider themselves radicals are aligned with Citibank and Wells Fargo with like the exact things they believe.
Yeah. 4 years or 2016 election, I guess it was, I noticed that the Communist Party of the U.S. Was supporting Hilary Clinton. That's a perfect example of confusing people to be utterly useless.
Or it shows how little communist there is in the Communist Party of the United States.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can take this show in really any direction we want. Ray, did you want to? You are working on something. Did you want to talk about that, or we could go into questions? It really, we have a free for all here.
Questions are okay. I'm right in the middle of thinking about what to write about. Something to do with development and immunity, and how the whole system has been warped so much that it's almost impossible to talk about how the immune system works. And so it's a perfect background for people saying ridiculous things about vaccines, for example, because there's no solid ground for making a decisive and final argument about any issue in the immune system. You have to see the history going back more than 100 years to see why the situation is so muddled around the vaccine issue.
Did Jamie Cunliffe and Polly Matzinger, did anybody take them seriously? Where it was like that morphostatic view of immunity ever a real contender against the traditional view?
Jamie Cunliffe and his danger hypothesis, I think he got right to the center of the issue, but he hasn't been keeping up with his studies in the last 15 or 20 years. He's hardly refined his thinking. What he did was very good. And the Polly Matzinger ideas have been, to some extent, adopted by the mainstream, but in the process, their meaning has been lost. Where the potential of Polly Matzinger's system or perspective was to go the Cunliffe direction. It has instead gone the clonal selection right down the mainstream. Everything staying the same.
And if I could butcher that point of view, it's that tissue injury, it comes before any kind of bacteria or fungi or anything like that, right? And so if you're worried about immunity, you should be worrying about limiting tissue injury.
Yeah, and our body is concerned with coming into existence and maintaining that existence and improving it if possible. And the Cunliffe idea is that when something goes wrong, whether it's a mechanical, radiation, or a chemical damage, or an organism that somehow created damage, in our system, that it's the damage that our body is concerned with. And in the process of fixing that damage, it takes out the pathogen, whether it's part of an organism or a toxin or even radiation damage. The body takes the measures necessary to maintain its integrity, and not really thinking or designed for or evolved to attack enemies or other than self. It's the process of optimizing the self that, as a sideline, it happens that sometimes we develop the antibodies and so on for taking out viruses and bacteria and parasites.
Weren't there some studies showing that depending on the occupation, specific occupations had a much higher rate of autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, like boxers, since they continuously damage their knuckles and various other joints, they're much more likely to develop this autoimmune condition. Hasn't this ever attracted attention of the mainstream medicine saying, well, there is a connection between chronic tissue injury and autoimmune conditions?
Very little. About 25 or 30 years ago, I saw a single article in which they took a piece of cow cartilage, and I forget who they injected it into, maybe rabbits, and when it was in a fresh condition, it didn't elicit antibodies. But if they just twisted the cartilage, gave it a little bit of mechanical stress, then it elicited antibodies. And that was like an image of how easy it is to induce the antibody reactions you see in autoimmune conditions.
Have you seen the recent studies? I know you've said this many times, but recently they confirmed that endotoxin is directly responsible for the flares of rheumatoid arthritis.
I've been following that general line that any injury to the tissue will bring up the so-called autoimmune system. Virus infections in some of the experiments were lethal if the organism wasn't allowed to produce antibodies. The virus that would bring up the antibodies would in itself not produce the disease, but the antibody itself was there mostly to clear out the damaged tissue rather than to attack the virus.
Do you think chronic low-grade endotoxemia, as they call it, can be a factor in many of these autoimmune conditions, constantly causing this small level of injury? And then eventually, I guess, if the organism is energetically depleted severely, then sort of like a chronic autoimmune condition sets in?
Yeah, and things like lupus and the famous named autoimmune diseases, including Sjogren's syndrome and thyroid
Hashimoto,
and probably MS. In some of these, such as lupus, I've seen very clear diagnoses of everything confirming that it was the so-called lupus condition causing the arthritis and other symptoms. But just by correcting their vitamin D, calcium intake, progesterone and thyroid, those all of the symptoms disappeared, and they gradually started having a regression of the antibodies.
Ray, so you're saying you don't need to go on the carnivore diet if you have an autoimmune disease?
No, keeping your blood glucose up and your carbon dioxide high from oxidizing glucose. I think those are the basic anti-inflammatory things that will correct all of the autoimmune diseases.
I was making a joke, but actually, like, when a person does eat an all meat diet and they do experience like a improvement in their symptoms, it probably would be a reduction in endotoxin, right?
Yeah. So many people are eating indigestible stuff that causes inflammation of their intestine, and a meat diet will simply represent the absence of toxic indigestible foods, but that gives you very quick relief, like a fast. A week of fast has very often completely relieved the spondylitis types of arthritis and inflammation. But after you are on that diet for a while, the excitatory inflammatory effect of the unbalanced phosphate and iron intake, a very imbalanced diet eventually brings up other problems just as serious.
One last question about this, and then we can move on. In the complex biochemical web of all the stress substances, we were talking last time about PTH being like all roads lead to parathyroid hormone. Where would you put endotoxin in that whole mix?
It's a constant threat everywhere and all the time. And the bad diet choices will make it take over and become dominant. But even with the best diet, just something like a physical shock or an emotional shock can reduce the barrier function of the intestine enough and slow the digestion so that you absorb more endotoxin. So it's very controllable, but it's always a present danger.
I saw some old studies in the 50s and 60s showing that they suggested that the main mechanism of the increased barrier permeability in the gut during stress was estrogen, because when they basically gave an estrogen blocker, the effects of stress on the increased endotoxin in the blood disappeared. Do you share that view, or?
Oh yeah, the capillaries are where the intestine barrier is most important, and everywhere in the body, estrogen weakens the capillary barrier.
Amazing stuff. Thanks for that. Or maybe should we do a little advertisement using air quotes here for your newsletter? Okay, the newsletter is available by email now, and it's $28 US, which can be paid through PayPal at raypeatsnewsletter@gmail.com. You can also order all of Ray's books, from PMS to menopause, progesterone and orthomolecular medicine, Generative Energy, my favorite, Mind and Tissue, Nutrition for Women, and then Progest-E from Kenogen. So you can email Catherine to purchase Progest-E Kenogen@gmail.com, and each bottle contains 3,400 milligrams of progesterone. And while we're on the topic of progesterone, maybe I could kick questions off here with Marcelo's question. And he says, "Hey, Danny, can you ask Ray if he had ever seen or heard of a woman regaining her fertility taking high-dose progesterone? We're talking to someone who has been infertile for a decade or more."
When I was teaching nutrition classes, there were several women who said they had been infertile for more than 10 years, and it was a 3-month class, and usually there were 2 or 3 people during that class who would suddenly get pregnant, just with almost all of them just with the diet changes, but it was to increase their progesterone and thyroid and to get their estrogen under control. And one woman, a medical doctor who hadn't had, she had diagnosed ovarian failure when she was, I think, about 35. And by carefully taking a blood test about every week or 2, she imitated the natural hormones of the cycle with small amounts, generally, of both thyroid and progesterone. That doesn't take a huge amount when it's at the right time. And I think, I forget her exact age, but she was in her 40s and had been perfectly infertile for over 10 years and had a baby very quickly as soon as she got her blood test showing the hormones in the right range.
That's amazing. Thanks for that. Okay. Okay. First question. Ray's thoughts on the importance of posture in health. Does good posture come from good health or vice versa?
I think good health makes you feel springy and energetic, and so you take on the aspect of a springy, energetic person. If everything hurts and you're tired, naturally everything is going to slump.
I think a long time ago, you wrote to somebody I knew, and you were specifically talking about maybe DHEA and testosterone, like causing a lot of the slumping. I mean, of course, those are energetic types of therapies.
Yeah, and the pregnenolone and progesterone work with them. The fascia that hold up your skin are, even though they're basically fibroblast type cells, in the absence of those protective steroids, they go limp. And given just pregnenolone, for example, but the others all have a similar effect, just a dose of pregnenolone will cause the fascia to contract, showing that they have the properties of smooth muscle cells, besides being the tough connective tissue that holds your whole body organs in place. And for example, if the fascia get loose, the tendons and capsules around tissues all get slack, and it can lead to the prolapse of the uterus, for example. And several months ago, a woman told me that she was, her doctor had planned to do surgery to pin her uterus back where it should be, but she was using a mixture of DHEA and progesterone, both topically and orally, and her uterus normalized. No surgery needed to hold it in place. That same thing, where it happens throughout your body, undoubtedly it's going to affect your posture and the feeling of strength in your joints.
Amazing. Thanks for that. Okay. Does Ray think it's possible that apes are actually devolved human beings?
Yeah, I've joked about that a lot. That if the vegetarians found a very congenial environment where they could eat all the vegetables they wanted, their intestine would get bigger and bigger, and their brain would get a smaller cortex and so on. The parts of this have all been demonstrated the more fibrous your diet is, the bigger your colon gets. And you can cause radical changes in a growing monkey, for example, just by the amount of fiber in the food. And a poor diet very powerfully limits the growth of your brain. And I don't know about the distribution of body hair, but the length of the arms and legs is also something that's very responsive to gestational conditions.
Georgie, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but do you want to ask Ray that question you talked about last time about the divergence of people that are following the rules versus, or maybe I can just ask him.
Yeah.
You'd probably do a better job. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Which one? Like what do you mean they're following the rules?
Like with the people that don't want.
Basically, I mean, I thought that evolution can work backwards too. Basically, if the environment is not energetically conducive to maintaining higher complexity of species, it's not just that apes are devolved humans. We may devolve into a lower level species. I'm actually, my question is related to this lady is that, well, if the monkeys eat mostly leaves and fruit, aren't the leaves very rich in the keto acids? So why would that be a poor diet? I mean, it seems like they can get plenty of protein.
Because they're full of toxins. Lately, I've been talking more about the causes of human development with a big brain, and the areas where the biggest brains of fossils have been found. And I think if you look at the idea of evolving in reverse when you eat too many leaves, if you instead of leaves, if you have a very good climate that produces huge amounts of various fruits, the extreme concentration of calories, you can either get the necessary proteins from the right selection of fruits, or you could occasionally add eggs and bugs and so on. But an abundance of fruit would provide the high calorie guarantee that is needed for maintaining the very expensive brain. The hunting diet, if you eat lots of meat, which some evolutionists have suggested, the meat, even though it provides the essential proteins, doesn't necessarily provide the very high concentration of glucose and the materials for metabolizing glucose. It tends to cause hypoglycemia. In fact, the more meat you eat, the more insulin you secrete to handle the disposition of the protein. And if you aren't taking in carbohydrate, then the meat will give you chronically increased cortisol and a tendency towards hypoglycemia from the maintained high insulin.
You're telling me Klaus Schwab wanting us all to eat bugs? He's on the right track?
What was that?
Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum. You know, he's all about us eating bugs as soon as possible.
Yeah, there, I suppose, adequate protein. Once I had some very nice things that seemed to be like little fish patties, but after I'd eaten them, they turned out to be mosquito larvae.
There's a Mexican restaurant in D.C. and they serve tacos made from locusts. Is this like a common thing in Mexico, or is this some kind of a monstrosity that they concocted here?
I never heard of the locusts, but around the lakes, you've seen the butterfly net fishermen on Lake Pátzcuaro, probably.
Yeah.
I don't know if they still do it, but they used to have these big nets that they would skim the mosquito larvae with, so they could collect them in really nutritious quantities. And they had a pleasant, mildly fishy taste.
That has to be just pure punishment, like the bug agenda. Like, the oligarchs are just like mad, and they want to abuse the citizens. And everybody eats bugs in Thailand. That's what I remember. Okay, great stuff. Thanks for that, Ray. What does Dr. Peat? What Dr. Peat thinks about life after death?
I never really think about it. I have read lots of discussion and more or less evidence. A physics professor, one of the most famous physical chemists in the world. I always have trouble remembering his last name, but he became notorious at the University of Texas, or Texas A&M maybe, for doing experiments that showed transmutation of heavy metals into gold. And after he retired, having experienced the powers that come to bear on anyone who thinks outside of the system, such as believing that transmutation can happen at non-nuclear energy levels, cold fusion, for example. He wrote about the history of communicating with the dead. And his book, The New Paradigm, I think it's called, has lots of interesting historical discussions of fairly convincing information transfer from post-living people to presently living people.
I wish I had saved it. There was actually a great response to this question on the YouTube comments section, but they started with St. George's. The living state is the degree of electronic desaturation, if that's correct. And they were saying, like, when you die, you go down to a lower level of energy metabolism and a lower level of consciousness. Does that sound right to you?
I think it's on a completely different level. The neutrino C idea as the ether for interaction of all substance, physical things like gravity and electricity, the common medium of neutrino C actually has pretty good evidence. And the neutrino C can resonate for a very low energy, but of the appropriate frequency. Very low energy patterns can influence this ether or neutrino C. And I think that's where the telepathic and transgenerational communication, how it's working.
So
do you think what we call the soul, maybe something like a standing wave in the neutrino sea?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'm very for a layman, like, so the physical body disappears and we melt into this neutrino sea, something like that? Or
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's still on the internet, but there was a very good video doing the physical energy calculations called No More Secrets. A Canadian psychologist who died. Persinger, yeah. That just shows the physical energy possibilities for these externalized patterns that people can tune into.
So do you think that principle of deja vu that people experience, like they have seen that before, it's basically resonating with a past, with the brain state of not even their own, basically of a previous life, so to speak, or a person that I don't know, a very similar energetically wise, if we can say that, their soul maybe still being in the neutrality. So what we experience as ancestral memories could be just resonating with those standing waves that are still there.
But the deja vu, where you are experiencing something that you can actually see it coming at you, so you know, in some sense, you have already seen it. But our ordinary consciousness, we are constantly foreseeing a little bit of the future. And we ordinarily only project it 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 seconds into the future. But when you're listening to someone sing a tune or make a sentence, you can anticipate what's coming, and there's no simple dividing line between what's immediately past and what's immediately to come. The brain is in ordinary things like talking and singing. The brain is very oriented towards forming an image of what's about to come, and that can vary. Just a well-stimulated brain can go much farther into hearing what's coming and interpreting what has just passed. If you aren't attending to someone in a lecture and suddenly at the end of a sentence they say a word that is important to you, you can wake up and replay, get back to the beginning of that sentence, even though you weren't consciously recording it. So you can make your brain back up and deliver something that you missed.
Well, I was just going to say that the lack of clear dividing line between the immediate past and the incoming immediate future, I think that line seems to be extend way further out, because there are studies published showing that people that have learned something as little kids completely forgot it, and they went through some kind of a trauma where they basically, usually an electric shock of sorts, suddenly remember everything in vivid detail from things that happened decades ago. And managed to basically reconstruct through a story that was later verified, because I guess that event was recorded somewhere, that they basically had an incredibly detailed memory that they were able to connect with. It was very, very distant past. We're talking several decades.
Yeah, and if you think of the incredible detail in that kind of memory that we're ordinarily completely unconscious of, that kind of extreme detail, I think, can extend it into the future, even though you're not attending to it. Sometimes the deja vu experience is when something slips in your brain and you forget to ignore enough of what's coming in, and suddenly you see what's to come, for maybe 10 or 15 seconds ahead.
What do you think of synchronicity? Do you think it's a sign of us resonating well with the environment? It seems to occur when people are in particularly good energetic state and attentive to the environments.
Yeah, there are a couple of very good books on synchronicity. One by F. David Peat is a good one. Pretty much the history of stories about it. But I think that's true that things are, again, the ether or the neutrino sea, I think is guiding causality enough that sometimes things will choose to happen because you're ready to perceive them.
I see. And one last question related to the, I guess, ancestral memories. There have been several published cases of people undergoing brain surgery, and then when they wake up, they suddenly start speaking fluently a foreign language that they had never heard before in their lives. What do you think could explain that? Would it be a resonance with with a dead soul or a previous brain state, or what could it be? Because they've never learned that language in their lifetime.
One of the cases I read about many years ago was a woman who had been a cleaning lady in some academic organization. She had spent years scrubbing floors and emptying wastebaskets for professors who spoke different languages, but just being present. When she had a brain accident, suddenly she could speak the languages that she had been around, but not knowingly attending to.
I see. So the brain acquired. I mean, the brain is capable of resonating with past events, though not always on demand. Some kind of a trigger is needed.
Yeah. Aldous Huxley took up one of the ideas that was introduced, I think, at the end of the 19th century, and thought of the cortex of the brain as a filtering device. And when something damages the cortex enough to get it out of the way, the full complexity of reality can break through.
I think I'm going to give myself a TBI to speak Spanish better.
Are you familiar, Ray, with the Hinduistic ideas? Probably are, of prana and akasha. Akasha, I guess, being the equivalent of the neutrino sea, where every event that ever happened basically is recorded forever and continues to exist as an analogy, I guess, of a standing wave. And then depending on the intellectual or consciousness state of the person practicing yoga, they can tune into that and basically have access to all of the events that have already happened.
Yeah, that sort of thing, the new paradigm is it has really been developing for thousands of years. In pretty much all of the cultures around the world, there's this idea that under certain circumstances you can tune in and know much more than ordinary knowing could produce. Like the George Watson's story of the magic mushroom. He was eventually it turned out that he was working with the government, but he was at the time just a hobbyist, a rich person wanting to investigate the magic mushroom culture of Mexico. And one of their experiments was to, because the people talked about the ceremonies as their mail service, just so he could be there watching their procedures, he asked what was happening with his son in New York. and the shaman told him that something very serious was going on, and so he, when he got back to Mexico City, he called his son and found that he had got a draft notice that day and was in an emotional state. But there are lots of stories like that where the mushroom takers can focus in on something in very, very remote places.
So the process of learning, would it be fair to say that it's basically the change of the structure of that, or even the frequency of that standing wave in the neutrino sea as we observe and interact with new events? Is that how we learn?
I think so. Since very, very early, I don't really know when I concretized it, but I began seeing consciousness as something electronic or finer, either the neutrino sea or a sort of coherence of electrons, sort of like the conductive electrons in a metal. But I've visualized the process of consciousness in the brain as being this sort of a jelly-like ethereal material that we push around with our biological activity in the nerves, but that what's really happening is that we are the resonance process in this conductive electronic or subelectronic substance. And so knowing, if that's what our everyday knowing is doing at its basis, then those exceptional experiences of knowing things we shouldn't know, it would fit in with the idea that we have adopted a way of using our cortex to filter out those ultra fine details of reality.
Amazing stuff. Thanks for that, guys. Please ask Dr. Peat about the about the safety of dental implants. Are there issues in terms of inflammation / autoimmune response or toxicity? Thank you.
The stories I've read about the failures made such an impression on me that all of the successes don't seem very important when you hear about someone's jaw falling off, basically. The bone disappearing, the jawbone disintegrating to the point that they have to put a metal jawbone in.
I kind of forget about this, but I got my tooth knocked out in like a long time ago in 2009. I have a plastic retainer. Like what kind of devastating things is that doing to my health, do you think?
Just a plastic over your tooth, I don't think hurts anything especially.
Well, it's one that covers basically, it's like the front left tooth. So it covers all the teeth on the top. It's kind of ruining a lot of the back teeth because it's constantly there.
Yeah, I don't think it does any deep harm, but the idea of putting a foreign object, the teeth are separated from the bone by very special barriers, but to dig right into the bone and put a foreign object inside the bone, that just doesn't make biological sense. Sometimes the body can handle it and you won't lose your jawbone, but when it does, there's hardly any repair that's satisfactory.
So would you say dentures will be safer? Basically, they can do the exact same thing without the implantation risks?
Yeah, all kinds of restoration are preferable. Crowns can often be done on a basically destroyed tooth.
Amazing. This one's from our friend Dodie. She says, we know the purpose of the vaccine, if that's what you want to call it, but what is the purpose of the booster shot for COVID, and how does it relate to the variant?
The increasing insights into the appearance of the variant, so-called, it increasingly looks clear that the variants are nothing but the side effects of the various nucleic acid treatments. The first reaction of people like Luc Montagnier was that the variants were caused by the immunity to the first one, and so the virus would mutate and become maybe more and more infectious, but usually that kind of resistance of the host generally leads to it becoming less deadly while being more infectious. But as the information has come in, it looks like there might not be any such thing as a gamma, delta, whatever variant, but simply that it's a name that's being given to the symptoms produced by the original vaccine. And so if that's the case, then the booster shot is, if it's the real vaccine material, it's just going to produce more so-called variants, more vaccine symptoms.
Great stuff. Thanks, Dodie. Thanks, Ray. Okay, does Ray identify himself as a social anarchist in the sense of excluding rent sinking, forming worker cooperatives, freeing the individual from authority, collectivism, direct democracy, mutual aid, etc.?
No, I think organization, if it's allowed to develop, the systems have been very quick to kill any incipient organization, but to the extent that they can spontaneously come into existence, you'll have consumers, cooperatives, and producers, cooperatives, and the organization will be what suits the people on the ground level. But if that's allowed to develop, it will develop, and they will find the best way for these ground level cooperative organizations to cooperate on a larger and larger scale. So I think that's a natural course of development. If they could, if some of these spontaneous cooperative groups could somehow take over the state, then you'd have the problem of maybe the consumers having more control than the producers. But if it grows up from the ground up, you're going to have to solve the problems of each level of organization as they come about. So I don't think there's any problem with evolving even a world level state, as long as it's based on these spontaneous surface level.
Is there any truth to, I mean, the way it at least looks to me is that the social structure and the political structure are in a sense a metabolite of the health of the people that are building them. So if the people are relatively healthy, they can thrive under a variety of systems without them being exploitatory and degenerating into the worst that a particular system has to offer. So instead of worrying about a specific political system, wouldn't be the most prudent thing would be to just sort of like optimize or maximize individual health and then see what kind of structure emerges from there?
Yeah, because different cultures, for example, military-oriented cultures are. There's evidence that they are very tightly connected with child abuse and body mutilation and repression of sexuality in children. Those things are closely tied with sadistic group policies and sadistic war-making, head chopping, and so on. And those, you don't want one of those societies to take over a larger government. It has to be basically an indulgent social organization that doesn't oppress its own children.
But in a group of healthy people, that sort of society wouldn't form to start with. My concern is that as soon as we say, oh, we should prevent that sort of culture taking over and then establishing itself, then the only way to fight such a vicious thing is through basically other kinds of violence, which ultimately tends to be kind of self-defeating, because if you continue this conflict long enough, even the good peaceful culture will eventually militarize itself through this constant conflict that is being going on. So it seems to me that the only way to ensure a sort of like semi-stable existence of a large group of people is make sure that as many of them are as healthy as possible, and then natural non-exploitative order should arise.
Yeah, the problem is that an urge to conquer tends to lead to conquest, and that involves such things as being hostile, outlawing good food, for example. The conquest can take the form of establishing a medical system that doesn't allow preventive methods. Says everything has to be focused on killing the pathogens, cutting out the defects, and so on. So the a society that asserts the importance of being healthy is itself in danger of offending the sadistic cultures and stimulating the oppression from them.
So I guess there is some truth to the saying that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom, even for healthy people?
I think so, until 2 or 3 generations, you might outgrow the sadistic tendencies that have been inculcated for so long.
164 people watching right now. Thank you guys so much. Sincerely appreciate. Give this episode a like. All donations here will be sent to Ray. I don't think I sent you the last donation, Ray. I've been very busy, but I will send them to you. I promise. Georgi Dinkov, thank you so much for being here. Obviously, Ray, thank you so much for doing this so regularly. Such a pleasure to have you on. Okay, this next question. What does Ray think? What does he think is the role of estrogenic predominance in sexual orientation and paraphilic disorders? So sexual fetishes, nymphomania, excessive masturbation, and porn addiction. What do you think about that, Ray?
One of the problems with high estrogen is that it doesn't allow sexual satisfaction. It's the prod to seek satisfaction, but it requires a good balance of thyroid and progesterone and androgens to achieve satisfaction, and so it can lead to such things as nymphomania or insatiability. And at the same time, it has this toxic excitatory effect on the brain. So it can contribute to obsessiveness, hyperactivity, poor attention, everything you do to increase your biological energy and vitality is tending to keep estrogen subdued.
Amazing. So a similar track. Is celibacy dangerous in a relationship that will be long-term for the foreseeable future?
I think it's always a result of an imposition, like these sadistic cultures suppress women's sexuality in particular, and they start very early by often mutilations, including circumcising both girls and boys to remove the satisfaction of sexual interest.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Ray. Okay, last sex question here. Not to put him in the public ire, but what does Ray think of but does Ray think homosexuality is optimal normalcy?
If it's optimal or what?
I don't really know what they meant by that, but I guess your take on homosexuality.
I think the gist of the question is the person thinks that homosexuality is driven by hormonal imbalances and it's not an optimal, healthy sexual state.
Yeah, the evidence from history as well as animal experiments are that you can produce it by stress during gestation, and everyone is abnormal in some way, so it isn't something that I think law should be involved in regulating in any way. But I think the evidence is clear that it's a particular product of both prenatal and early life stresses.
Have you seen the more recent studies demonstrating that finasteride can pretty reliably induce homosexuality in animals?
No, I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess you can never know if an animal is homosexual or not, but they started displaying, the male animals started behaving like females and started courting the other normal males and assumed like a mating position and, basically started behaving like females. And when they stopped administering the finasteride, basically they became asexual. They stopped behaving like females, but they didn't revert back to behaving like males either. And only when they were administered very high doses of testosterone did they sort of, not completely, sort of revert back to acting like normal males sexually.
How long ago was that done?
That study is, well, it's not that old. I think it was from the late 90s.
Well, to tag along with what you said, if a culture is promoting stress in every way, shape, or form, and then stress promotes homosexuality, it's not like a moral judgment on a person. They're just expressing what the signals from the environment are telling them to do, right?
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Ray. Sincerely appreciate it. Okay, let me, okay, I get this question a lot, so this is why I'm asking. What are Ray's thoughts on Adolf Hitler and his expulsion of banking cartels and Masons from Nazi Germany? And then the other part of this question was a little too hot for YouTube.
He had many right perceptions, but in a very crooked way. He convinced the voters that Germany had been close to revolution and the fear was that the voters would gradually support a Bolshevik type of government. And so all of the money and bank powers of Germany and England and the U.S. Concentrated on supporting him as the barrier against Bolshevism. And he developed a language that would convince the voters who wanted social welfare, guaranteed employment, health care, and so on, good transportation, and so on. He talked to them and said he would give them socialism, but he told the bankers that it would be national socialism that wouldn't threaten to benefit anyone outside of German society. And so he had lots of progressive pro-worker things for German citizens, but at the same time, he was following the instructions of the money system. And his anti-Semitism was partly just to convince the working people that he had an awareness of the manipulators of money and the banks, but he really was working with some of the top Zionists, and they wanted pressure on European Jews so that they would move to Israel and set up a new country. So there was collaboration between the Zionists and Hitler for a while, but it finally turned into the murderous anti-Semitism. But the things such as the anti-Masonry, that was part of the German culture at the time. He used those things to keep his mass support, along with giving them cheap little cars and high-speed highways, things that simply made the Germans able to be distracted from what he was doing elsewhere.
Amazing. Thanks for that. Okay. How might Ray respond to the question of why worker ants are sent out into dangerous conditions while queen ants are protected, other than worker ants are not reproductive, cannot pass on genes anymore, while queens can? Same with bees. I wasn't joking when I said ants were observable national socialists. Their organism also strategy is clearly designed around a collective effort to provide for reproduction of the tribe's genetic material. And they have a rigid deterministic caste system where sterile ants are sterile their whole lives and will readily give up their lives to protect the productive queens.
But at the same time, individual ants can be intelligently altruistic, one ant to another.
So it's not. I mean, it's a hierarchical structure, but they're also altruistic to each other at the same case when they actually should be competitive. If this was truly a national socialistic system, right?
Yeah, and there are lots of good people doing good things in the United States, for example, even though the system is definitely not designed to have good people doing good things.
Let me ask the question, which Danny didn't, but it's right there. Somebody asked, is Ray Peat a communist? And I know it's a very loaded word.
Well, I thought you answered it already. That's why I didn't answer it. But
no, there was another one whether he's a social anarchist, but somebody asked directly, is Ray Peat a communist? There you go.
I'm not sure what the difference is. If you define either of them very thoughtfully. There's not really any difference. You want to get rid of tyranny, and you want to have cooperation, and it's the idea of communism essentially goes back to Christianity as the main source of those ideas, and it has developed a lot of historical confusion around it, but the Christian beliefs are at base, you could say that they're predominantly communistic.
Didn't William James say that Christ was a communist or something along those lines?
A lot of people have, because of his attitude towards money changers and the common person, even the outcasts of the system. He was definitely a bottom-up person, and you can call that anarchism or communism, either way.
Do you think it's possible to have Christianity without the involvement of the church? And by the church, I specifically mean corrupt structures like the Vatican, with their history of child abuse and financial machinations and supporting the Nazis and everything else.
I think one of the most interesting books on Christianity was Wilhelm Reich's book, The Murder of Christ. And he gets much of his guidance from the New Testament.
Amazing. Okay, let me search real fast I skipped this question. Okay, in regards to an extremely morbidly obese person in their 40s and 50s, what are the first steps they should do to tackle their weight? Would some fasting regimen like alternative day or OMAD be feasible in this situation simply because of the danger posed by their weight? If they're 300 plus pounds and they simply might not live long enough to take the slower PUFA depleting bioenergetic route.
And what were the alternatives?
Well, they were saying, should I fast or should I do one meal a day? Or I guess another possibility was like liposuction. Like, what if somebody's extremely obese? What do you think? And they don't have a lot of time. What do you think they should do?
All of the alternatives are extremely harmful, and I've wondered whether there might not be a type of surgery to remove.
Hello?
Yeah, did we just lose Ray? Yeah, we did. Okay, I thought it froze. Okay, let's. Oh, Ray, you there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You just dropped out for a second. I think we just start that question over if you remember.
Okay. The amount of damage is something that can be investigated. The way liposuction is usually done, just sort of stirring a suction tube around in the fat, causes lots of nerve damage as well as liberation of free fats into the system. And there might be surgical ways of removing a large mass such as abdominal fat while doing less systemic damage with good local anesthesia, for example. I think it might be possible to unload 40 or 50 pounds of fat without doing terrible damage. But a fast, especially if you're fat, that fat is going to travel through your brain and liver and other organs on its way out of the body. And so you're exposing yourself to a great prolonged toxicity. Even though I've seen someone fast steadily for 2 months to get over extreme obesity, I'm not sure that your lifetime effect on your health is going to be worth it.
What about chemical interventions? I mean, there is a tremendous track record of things like dinitrophenol being able to cure effectively even extremely morbidly obese people, of course, under medical observation, because it can easily kill you if you overheat. Wouldn't something like that be considerable?
Overdosing on thyroid does the same thing. At the right level, it can increase your safe oxidation of fats while helping to suppress the toxic random oxidation. Both DNP and thyroid can, carefully controlled, can reduce the toxicity of getting rid of the fat. But I think a diet high in calcium and vitamin D should be part of the program, because they will support safe oxidation and provide the nutrients that, for example, a high milk diet will keep your metabolic rate higher and suppress the toxic effects.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Okay, about 10, 15 more minutes here, and then we'll let you go, Ray. Thank you so much. Thank you, Georgie Dinkov. Appreciate it. Okay, let me define this question. Aside from painting, does Mr. Peat recommend any other practice for positive brain effects, such as knitting, sculpting, etc.?
Whistling, singing, playing a French horn, playing a recorder whistle, playing the cello or violin, all kinds of things that are very structured and stimulating.
Wouldn't things like gardening and tending to animals also work?
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. Okay, James says, as a social animal, humans seem to have a need to belong and experience connection with other people. How can we meet this need in the current authoritarian anti-life culture and avoid a life of atomized loneliness?
I don't know, but I keep looking around for what people can do. Just the simplest personal contact. If you can get 3 or 4 or more people together with a similar interest, such as little music groups, something that is harmless looking to the society, but getting people together, they're going to talk about their fate under the present system. So anything you can think of to put people into personal contact, I think is going to eventually lead to political progress and organization.
Okay, this person says, on the most recent radio network interview, Ray talked about a little about pheromones. He said a woman's emitted pheromones can change the way she is on birth control and again when she stops. Does Ray know whether what a woman emits and what she responds to changes in the lead up to menopause? And can a man's pheromones change as well, making him less attractive to his partner? Can a woman's sorry, this is a really long one. Can a woman's lack of interest in her long-term partner be due to pheromones? And last thing, can anything be done to restore the pheromones to attractiveness again?
Good diet and hormone activity is the best thing to optimize the pheromones. But it's true that both men and women have less of the attractive pheromones and probably gradually increase some repellent pheromones. I think little kids emit anti-sexual pheromones, that I think they induce parental attitudes towards them, and then around puberty, the chemistry changes towards sexual attraction, and to a great extent, I think the same attractants are emitted by both men and women, but with some subtle variations that I don't think anyone has a very clear idea of what a woman's attraction chemistry is, but I'm sure it contains some of the steroids that men emit.
Super simple question, but what is a pheromone? Like, what it's released by hair follicle?
It can be any chemical that is volatile enough that you can detect it at some distance from the emitter. Fatty acids of different sorts work for insects and other animals, but the most clearly defined human pheromones are derivatives of androgenic steroids.
Amazing. Let's do one last break here real fast for talk about Progest-E, and then I'll ask you one or two more questions. I'll let you go, Ray. Okay, so Progest-E from Kenogen. Email Catherine to purchase a bottle. She ships very quickly. She packs it in this like Mylar or something that protects it during shipping. It's kenogen@gmail.com. Each bottle of Progest-E contains 3,400 milligrams. I have a photo here. This is DHEA in this little thing here, and then I have a little tiny $15 scale, and then I mix it in this glass thing I got from Japan, which I'll never go back to again. Which is
the glass or Japan?
Japan, unfortunately, because I will never travel again, unfortunately. And then you can, the newsletter is available by email now. It's $28, which can be paid through PayPal. And I mean, best deal on the internet for Ray's bi-monthly newsletter. And you can also purchase his books. And those are basically collector's items, and I'd recommend everybody obtain them. Okay, so again, I think we've talked about this many, many times, but I guess we can't talk about it enough. So this person says, if forced to be inoculated, are there any supplements or diet that will counteract the harmful side effects of the mRNA vaccine?
The first thing is to consider your defenses and resistances, how you can avoid getting it put into you, and if you can find alternatives such as a certificate of pre-existing immunity, or maybe a form of a vaccine that doesn't contain the nucleic acids, because the present ignorance, the reason the experiment is being done is because it has never been studied in humans before, and so you don't know what the outcome is. And as long as it's experimental, it's on its surface, meaning we don't know what the long-range outcome is going to be. And the animal evidence is that there could be terrible long-range effects, such as increased susceptibility to all kinds of infectious diseases, or to cancer, or to brain degeneration, or sterility. So if you allow yourself to be vaccinated, you're taking a big experimental gamble, the outcome of which you won't know as long as you're alive.
Are you disturbed? Go ahead.
The fact that the so-called variants are tremendously increased in the people who had the vaccine suggests that the disease effects of the virus and vaccine are essentially identical, and that is primarily through the toxic effects of the spike protein, and that is a fundamental and total promotion of inflammation in every system. Hypertension, development of autoimmune diseases, everything you can think of is promoted, which is promoted by angiotensin, is going to be a possible outcome of a vaccine. So the angiotensin receptor blockers and antihistamines and aspirin were known way back 10 or 15 years ago to protect against the toxic effects of the spike protein. The toxicity of that protein has been studied now for a long time, and so the Chinese were among the first to realize that angiotensin receptor blockers, antihistamines, and aspirin, simply by being anti-inflammatory, were the first things to resort to.
So does the mRNA that's in the vaccine, does it use the same mechanism through the ACE2 enzyme to get inside of the cell?
Well, once you get the RNA in, it doesn't matter whether it's free RNA that comes into you after being shed by someone who was vaccinated. It most likely is either in an exosome form or as free RNA coming out of their breath and skin and saliva and getting into your system.
So what I'm getting at is there's no way to prevent the mRNA present in the vaccine from getting inside of the cell, similar to how we can prevent the virus from getting inside of the cell, the wild virus, by giving something like losartan or anything that blocks that specific entry pathway.
Nothing I know of. They're using a lipid for getting the RNA quickly into the cells, but other studies show that you don't really need the lipid. It will be taken up even in the naked RNA form, and that's just a tendency of cells is to take up circulating molecules, and sometimes they can be either assimilated or destroyed. But this particular fat happens to take the highest concentration in the ovaries, but distributes it into every kind of cell in the body.
I'm moving a house in November, and I found a place that I really liked, and we were doing all the paperwork, and the owner was like, can you send me your vaccine papers? And I was like, yeah, there's no way that's going to happen. And they're like, oh yeah, you can't move in there. I was like, oh, great.
In Mexico?
A gringo owned the house. And so it's not but it's just sign of times, sign of the future, I guess, or things that come. There's a very, very interesting, entertaining situation. Okay. Ray, we're going to say something, Ray?
No.
Oh, okay. Ray Peat, thank you so much. Stay on the line for just 1 minute, Ray. Georgi Dinkov, Thank you so much. Is there any parting words, Ray?
Nope.
And Georgi Dinkov, any parting words?
Well, I guess to me, the Appalachians start looking more and more attractive. If it's extremely rural and poor and has no internet and no cell phone service, I think it should be considered.
Guys, we have an amazing audience. I sincerely appreciate it. I get so many positive messages about these shows. They're so fun to do. Took a lot of work. Thank you so much, Ray, for making these so special whenever you're on. Thank you so much, Georgie, my partner in crime. And thank you for the amazing audience. Give this episode a like, subscribe to the Substack, or follow the show in some way, shape, or form. and then also send all those donations to Ray. Guys, thank you so much. Have an amazing weekend, and we'll see you sometime next month. Okay, bye, everyone.